Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of Vertical Stars Podcast fourth season. My loyal listeners, thank you for continued support. This is an amazing episode because J.G. Jones and Phil Bram board the mothership to discuss Dust to Dust from Image Comics. Now, come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Jones and Mr. Bram. Thank you for coming to Vertical Stars Podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So, my pleasure. So, I always start off with a question of inspiration. So, inspire your love for comics and who your earliest influences.
You want to go first, Phil?
Mine will be quicker. I grew up in Oklahoma, and for whatever reason, I never had my hands on comics. I don't know what that is, but once I got a little older, it was R. Crumb. Starting with the movie, I never saw the comics. But actually before that, I saw like some heavy metal comics. I remember those. And then seeing that get made into a film. But I would say Crumb and maybe some P-Card and stuff like that. But I was already in my 20s by then. You know, I never really read comics. And then I met Jeff.
Late bloomer.
Yeah. So, but Jeff's been in the business forever, so I'd like to hear how he started.
Oh, I was a typical kid. I read comics from the time I was really young. I had a company store situation, more or less. My first job was sweeping the parking lot of the drugstore, and that's where they sold all the comics in my little town. So they got all their money back in comics, before I left. And I had an aunt who worked for the magazine distribution in Baton Rouge. And she would send me boxes and boxes of comics that had the covers torn off. They would get their refunds for the ones that weren't sold. They just returned the covers. So I read all of my comics that were already destroyed. Probably why I became mostly a cover artist later in life, making up for all those lost covers I didn't get to see when I was a kid.
You said a small town. Was that a town in Midwest or Pennsylvania?
You're asking me, Jeff?
Both.
Okay. I grew up in Oklahoma, in the southwest corner, but we weren't from that area. My dad, he was in the Air Force, but I was young enough, and it's in my blood. I probably got there when I was 7, 6, something like that. He's just so allergic to people. He just stayed in Oklahoma. He's from Connecticut. He just, he couldn't even drive around here. He just loves Oklahoma. He loves the pace. So I ended up growing up there like that. I was the youngest of 3. So I spent more time there than any of my siblings.
How about you, Mr. Jones?
I grew up in South Louisiana, pretty much in the small town. I didn't hit a big city until I went to college at Baton Rouge. But very much a rural life when I was a kid, until I was a little older. Went to a slightly larger town to finish high school and everything. But I just basically grew up running around out in the sticks all day. It was a lot of fun.
So we're going to discuss Dust to Dust from Image Comics, and Dust to Dust is a beautiful looking, fantastic combo that takes place in Oklahoma around 1935. So how did the idea come to fruition?
Well, Phil and I met when we were both in New York, and became good friends. And I was reading this book called Worst Hard Time, about the Dust Bowl, and I loaned it over to Phil, and I said, we should do a story for a book of this. And I think he was amenable. I think it was the Oklahoma connection, that made me have the initial idea. I was like, oh, well, Phil knows Oklahoma, and he's a writer, and he's an artist. So, we can make that happen.
So why specifically the 1935 Oklahoma? What was it about that time period that fascinates you guys the most? How much research did it take to realize the time period?
A lot. Did a lot of reading. And, you know, one weird thing about me growing up was my father's family was very spread out. So all of his siblings had grown up like during the Depression. So I grew up hearing all these great stories um, from them growing up back in the Depression. Um, and it always kind of just stuck. My dad had an obsession with old cars, so we were always fixing up old Model A cars and things like that. And I have a bent towards history, so it was all kinds of in there floating around all the time. It's like, well, you know, I work in comics now, so let's do some stories.
So I think one part that could be challenging is that was going to take place in 1935, which in the time and the place can be very alien to modern audiences. So how did you make sure that it was something that modern audiences could identify with?
Um, well, I really think that the time period is just so seminal in America. Is the Depression just affected pretty much everybody. Everyone was out of work. Um, and Phil can talk about what happened in Oklahoma with, you know, the agriculture kind of crashing, um, the drought, um, stuff like that. You know, it's pretty much just rife for stories. Um, Always enjoyed stuff like Grapes of Wrath and Of Mice and Men, Steinbeck, and um, you know, Woody Guthrie and stuff like that. So it just seemed a natural place to land and start playing in. Things were so bad. It's like, well, how can they get any worse? Um, let's have a look. How could this get worse? And one other thing was I was really looking, I didn't want to write something where I had to deal with cell phones and all this modern technology. I wanted to push it back a little bit where we had cars and a certain level of technology. But, you know, immediately, you know, now with DNA and FBI and everything, they can solve stuff pretty fast.
Yeah.
So Phil, so how did your experience and knowledge of Oklahoma help you to realize this story?
You know, I don't know if it really did outside of just the landscape itself. I love that landscape. I love being out west and things are different visually. And mostly the way I wrote our script, I think looking back, it was more um, just these frozen frames, even though it took me a while to learn how to write for a illustrator. And I don't typically write third person either or whatever, but I started seeing it visually more than the story itself. Um, but I had to learn a lot. We both read that Worst Hard Time book. It's by Timothy Egan.
Mm-hmm.
It is, I mean, that's what did it. Even though I grew up in Oklahoma, I didn't know much about the Dust Bowl, and you just hear it, you don't really know it or anything. And the more just reading that book, like all the weird, like it was almost sci-fi, like the lightning and all these weird events were happening because of nature, and it's the same thing we're seeing now, in my opinion. The chickens come home to roost.
Yeah.
So that for me, it was about that. It was like, they start growing all this crop and it works for a while. It's interesting when things work for a while and then they don't even, they're wrong to do. and then you watch it unfold. And I like that element of the story. I am from Oklahoma. Before Jeff and I met, I was deep into Woody Guthrie, and you hear those Dust Bowl ballads. Everyone should listen to those. They're just amazing. But Oklahoma, it's the same as anywhere, really. Jeff probably grew up more rural than me, maybe.
So
I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question.
no, it does. Well, was there like one visual or particular concept that really kind of captured what this story was going to become?
Um, Jeff, I'll let you go on that.
Um, I'll try. I was thinking, about the Dust Bowl as a fish bowl. There's a certain aspect of growing up in a small town where you're kind of stuck, and the idea gets heightened in the Depression because you have no options. You don't have your job is disappeared. Your family, you can't feed your family. And like I said, we were just thinking, well, how could this be any worse? It seemed like a natural place to do a serial killer story. See if we could make it worse and have everyone just stuck in this fishbowl. They can't leave. Anyone who tries to leave doesn't make it very far.
So interesting with Dust to Dust, as you mentioned, a serial killer. So far the first issue is mostly setup.
Yep.
Is the serial killer someone who's already been introduced to the story, or are we going to be meeting new characters?
Oh, we're going to meet a lot of new characters along the way. Um, the structure basically is when I first started working on it with Phil, we were thinking about graphic novel. So we were doing pretty much film structure setup. So when we got the deal together and decided to do it as a flop with floppies and then collect it, we had to do a lot of restructuring just with what we had, um, so beginnings and endings of each chapter became really crucial. But we didn't want to get away from introducing the landscape and the weird events and the kind of oddball people that are there, are interesting people. And, just like in a film, you're looking for the motivation for the different actors and why they do what they do. And I think it also impacted pretty strongly the way each of the characters speak. We wanted each of them to have a very personal point of view, cadence, the way they talk. So they're just not all the same because they're in the same area or environment. Everybody has something else going on, and we have to figure out what that is along the way.
So, one interesting thing about Dust to Dust is that it has this very realistic painted appearance. Why was that the perfect visual language for this book?
Um, I had done a painted book a few years ago, and it was set in Louisiana during a flood. So it was like very lush, and all the scenes were very wet. It was fully painted, and I really wanted to strip this thing down because the landscape, the story, the time period, and thinking about film at that time, everything was stripped down to just bare bones. So the first thing I did was get rid of the color. And because of the theme of the Dust Bowl, I decided just to do it all in sepia tones with a little bit of color thrown in here and there. Every issue has like a little bit of candy with some color thrown in from time to time.
Well, what part of that is already kind of interesting. Like I said, very minimalistic color. However, there is some definite red, especially on a book called Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasants that appears several times throughout the book. So why that book? Why is that sprinkled throughout the issue?
I think it has a little something to do with my own idea of I love those stories to begin with, and a lot of them are kind of bordering on horror and things going on. And I don't find it dissimilar to the potato famine in Ireland when the crops started to fail in Oklahoma in the Depression. For some reason, I saw some parallels there, and it's a book that I read and reread. So I just put it in there as kind of a little idea that could be a thematic idea that falls in there.
Well, and I think another part that's very interesting. There's a piece of dialogue, and I kind of feel like it kind of expresses a much larger idea, even though it's a very simple line of dialogue. So the line goes, it's in the first issue, all this dust gets into everything. And I think that it feels like that's symbolic of the Dust Bowl and the impact of the Dust Bowl and everything. So it can kind of break down the use of that piece of dialogue within the story. And does it have that larger meaning that is kind of subtle, but at the same time, very expressive of the of the first issue?
Yeah.
Jeff, you wrote that line, right?
Yeah, I think so.
I think you did. But yeah, I would agree with that. But go ahead.
It all goes back, to the biblical stuff about everything is dust. You return to dust. You come from dust. You return to dust. So I think some people are going to return to dust here.
So how are the people a product of their environment in this series?
Do you want to go for it, Phil?
It's going to make me ponder for a second. A product of their environment. They were duped. A lot of people were duped, thinking this would work for a while, and people knew it wouldn't, and people warned them. There's an interesting thing that when we first started working on this, it was the correlation to World War I. Mm-hmm. And not only the crops failing we helped feed the troops through the war, but it's then the troops coming back, the people coming back, getting back to life. And the visuals, once you realize the visuals are so similar, the guys in the trenches to the farms, buried farms, dead cattle. Once I saw Jeff start drawing some of those things, something bigger was going on here. It feels like it was almost out of the hands of the people themselves, even though people made bad decisions, you're part of you're thinking differently. That really interests me a lot. I could just go on and on about that. One thing I was thinking today about the Christmas truce during World War I.
Yeah.
When I was a kid and I heard that, that just freaked me out more. It's like, is that good? That's just bizarre. People celebrate it as humanity, but just what a bizarre time. And these guys coming back, and I always got this visual of a farmer out there who had served time, had been over there in the trenches, comes back, and now he's huddled with his kids, in these little shacks, and no money, no path forward. Kids are sick, all that stuff. It was so global, even though it's in this small little bubble, fishbowl, like you said. It just made me realize, it's that we're all in this together,
Now,
and we are.
Now, when you think of my pronouncing right, Cimarron County, am I saying it correctly?
Cimarron County.
Cimarron County. Is this sort of a town that's sprung up because of the crops that you mentioned, or are there deep roots in this town?
Do you mind saying that again?
Cimarron,
Cimarron County?
is this a town that kind of sprung up around what they're doing with the crops, or is this a county that had deep roots that kind of sprung up and then readdressed, I guess, because of the crop situation, as you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a good question because before that it would have been, ranches,
Yeah.
and indigenous people and stuff. But yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't know. So much of this we invented, but we used as much as we could from real places, and it's a hodgepodge of that stuff. So I don't know. I don't know when that town, when the buildings got built, was, who was the sheriff before Meadows? I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, that was the fun part for me was naming people and paying homage to my childhood. Lawton Meadows is my dad's best friend, Larry Meadows, and his family, they were police officers. That was the fun part. I really loved creating that world with you.
Yeah. A lot of the names I also borrowed from people I knew growing up, last names, first name.
Yeah, I'd never
Uh,
had so much fun writing. Writing, it's mostly torture when I write how I've always written. So it was such a challenge to write this with you because, you're already in the business and doing great things. And I'd heard your name a lot. So I was like, man, what a challenge. And it was such a great story. And, how could we not do it?
yeah.
You read that book and you're like, it just exploded into this world.
Yeah.
So when we think about Sheriff Meadows, okay,
I
is
love
he
sheriffs. I love that sheriff guy.
is he a native to Cimarron County? Is he someone who's like an implant into it? And why be a sheriff? I know there's also a line Hitler tells Meadows that he put the badge on him. So is he did he choose to be a sheriff? I mean, how did that whole situation with him being a sheriff and his roots into that county come from?
Well, he came back from the war. Well, his roots in the county. I think we say in the. I don't remember which issue. I'm not going to give anything away, but he did grow up on a ranch. I know we put that in, but he goes to the war, comes back, he gets married. He just starts drinking and falls apart. So I don't. Am I giving too much away there,
No,
Jeff?
no, not at all. You're right.
So he
The
gets
next issue, I think, too, it already starts addressing exactly.
okay. So that's an important part of the equation is that he gets he's like I'd say a Trump pick. He gets a badge slapped to his chest. Um, but he is that kind of a guy. He's who you'd want to be, sheriff. Um, and he drinks, but he's a functioning. He can function. But I love the line that you wrote. I don't know if it was in the story or in an interview or something, Jeff. Um, that he was just drowning his demons or something like that. You remember how it went?
Trying to.
I can't. It was such a good line, but
I'd like to take credit for it if it's a good line.
yeah. Um, but yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah, he's from the area, went to the war, came back, and he's a damaged soul, like
Yeah.
a lot of those guys were. But he's still got his head on. He's still pretty well functioning.
Now, when Hillard says, I put the star on your shirt, obviously there's a very significant line. Did he do it because he thought Meadows would be the best person to be the sheriff, or did he do it because he thinks he can control Sheriff Meadows?
Yeah, well, that's a mix.
Yeah, I think pretty much keep reading. All of that is in there. It's all in the book.
So does the sheriff view himself on some level as being bought?
I don't think
I
Meadows
don't.
thinks he's boss of anything. Maybe not even himself.
Did you say bot or
Boss.
boss?
A boss.
Bot. Um, did you hear that, Jeff?
Yeah. I don't
Okay.
think he considers himself bought. I think he just wanted a job, something to do. And he's oddly enough kind of a natural leader. You'll see definitely in issue 2, I think, and maybe more in issue 3. We get some backstory about why he's sort of a natural to be the sheriff. And, at that particular time, it wasn't being a lawman is not like it is now. When you're a police officer, back then, sheriffs were pretty much just the guy who went around and knocked heads and told everybody to be cool. And they had just allowed beer back in the early 30s, and hard liquor was still illegal. So they were basically supposed to be just whatever local law there was. Just keep the peace. It's more a peace officer than being a police officer. Is that fairly accurate? I think so.
I think so, and he definitely cares for people, and right out of the gate, you see that, And he was a leader in the war. He was, in the trenches, leading men, and he's a kind guy, but he's a strong guy.
Now,
I like that whole scene that Phil put together where he's caring for the little kid who's leaving with his family. Just that little moment, I was really taken with that. I think I came up with the book that he gave him, but Phil was really adamant on, he's caring for people. We need to show him.
That was, we wrote all that. I wrote my part on all that 16, 17 years ago.
Yeah.
And you read it again, and I love it. I'm not saying I just say it needs to be seen, that scene. I love it. Sorry if that sounds hokey. I just
no, not at all.
It's Jeff's illustrations, just to see something you write, and I'm not in that world. I've never written for a comic, and then to see it, he would send these to me for years, God, he's just working on this thing, and it's, to see it in print is, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, that's for sure.
Just so many pictures and images, and, you worked your ass off, man.
Still in the trenches, buddy.
You are still in the trenches, but that was fun. We got a tiny little rewrite thing a week ago, just a tiny little thing. And it was so much fun.
As I'm drawing, I keep coming up with things, and you keep coming up with things and sliding them in. So,
it's been so much fun.
Another part that's very interesting in the story is that, and it's kind of one of the arcs without the first issue, because the first issue is the one out so far, so I don't know what happens after yet, but just the first issue, the Olsen family. Now, one of the themes is that they're pulling up stakes and leaving Oklahoma. The issue even ends with them. Looks like they're going down towards this big dust tornado looking thing as well. So why is that family, their story, and them potentially pulling up stakes and heading to California an important theme in this series as well? And do they come up later on?
Yeah, they're very germane to the entire story. And what happens to them is, sort of kicks off a whole chain of events. So they're really crucial. And as far as people leaving, Oklahoma pretty much emptied out Western Oklahoma, and people went to California, went to, pick produce in California, oranges, whatever they could get any kind of work they could, in any industries. I think, what was it? Steinbeck wrote some stories about people going out in the fishing industry from
Yep.
Midwest and stuff like that. People didn't have work. They didn't have a livelihood. They needed to do whatever they could to survive. So that's the basis of the entire story. Is like you have to do what you can to survive without too much of a fine point on it.
Now, the issue ends with the Olsen family basically going into that tornado. I think that it was at the end. So, can you kind of tell me a little bit where that's headed?
Yeah, right into the dust storm. You can go online and see these amazing pictures of just these huge walls of dust. A lot of that weather comes and hits the Rockies and then comes down over the flat plains. But at the time, it wasn't carrying much moisture with it. And after the farmers had pretty much ripped up the land to grow wheat, there was nothing there to hold the dirt.
Hmm.
All the roots were gone. They would just, plow the whole freaking plains up. And then when the big windstorms would come, it would lift it up and carry it all away. There were even, I don't remember what the date was. It went as far as New York City was covered in walls of dust that came all the way from Oklahoma at one point.
Jeff,
So it's just
Jeff,
mad.
and that in the worst hard time, that guy on he was standing before Congress, I think, and he was stalling and stalling and stalling because he knew this dust was going to reach that far, or he thought it might, and it did. So in the middle of the day, he was testifying about these new methods of farming, and everyone was blowing him off, and to have that dust settle right where you're speaking about these things was it changed it.
Yeah.
I think Congress turned around and they started pumping some money and realizing, we're all in this together. We got to do it.
Yep. That was a very early government program. They sent people in to talk with the farmers about changing how they did things, make windbreaks, and so you're not just squandering everything for short-term gain.
So one thing that's kind of interesting as well is that, as you mentioned, this is a murder story, right? A serial killer with a serial killer. Given the idea of the dust storms and the danger of nature, is this also is there a parallel being made between the danger of humans and the danger of the nature around them?
Of course. I mean,
Yeah.
things are, with global warming and all the fires out in California, and it's like it feels very relevant to me.
It did when we first started it. It felt relevant, and now it's just off the charts. Fuck around and find out.
There you go.
That's
That's what they say in Philly.
Yeah.
Well, one thing kind of interesting when you mentioned a serial killer, because in modern times, right? If the serial killer shows up in Boston, a city of how many millions, everyone freaks out as if the serial killer is living next door at any given moment, and everyone freaks out that they're going to be the next target. Now, in Oklahoma, 1935, this is a much smaller town. So, what is the impact of a serial killer in a town that small compared to what it would look like now?
It makes it a little spookier. It's I don't know why the sparseness, I don't know. Yeah, you can't just your neighbor's a couple miles away, and how do you do it?
Yeah.
What do you hide in? So, not to give anything away, but that's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also,
Go ahead.
you made me think the people who are packing up and leaving. I mean, some people could just be there one day and go on the next, and
Yeah,
they might not. They might just assume they left.
a lot of people roaming around.
A lot of people on the roads roaming around.
Yep. a single guy, no family. You just keep going until something works better than where it was, maybe, if you can get
Yeah.
there. But man, you got a family, you're that's a whole nother ball game.
Yeah, because it's not just ballsy to, when you live there, there's serial killer. Obviously, there's fear of the victim and how do you, the serial killer living around. But as a serial killer, there's not that many people, so I mean, it's got to be a lot harder to hide what you're doing in a town that small and everyone kind of knows each other. So, I mean, that, and not only that though, but obviously you're killing the people that you know. You're not. It's not like in Boston if you're killing 20 people in a city of 10 million, you may not even ever met these people. In this town, you know the people you're going after. So for the serial killer and kind of get to his mind, because like I said, he's not introduced yet in the first issue as far as the serial killing starting. What does that say about him that he is so far successful in this small town? What does it say that he's killing the people that he has to know because the town is so small that you do know each other, which is different than our types of serial killers, like modern day ones. So can I dive into that just a little bit?
Sure, why not? I think our story makes it really obvious how he gets away with it for a period of time, because it might not even look like what you think it is. It might look like something else completely. Because like Phil said, people are coming in, coming out, moving around, different things happen. There's a lot of natural accidents, incidents that might look like something else. So we play with that a lot. And the person who is mainly responsible for deaths and dying is not necessarily the one that you're going to think it is right up front. So that there's a aspect of a mystery right around exactly what you were asking about. How does he hang around for as long as he does and do what he does? But of course, he's not going to be able to forever. And it all kinds of, when we started talking about the story, it all kind of fell right to the end. So a lot of stuff happens along the way, but man, I can't wait for those last few issues. It's just going to be completely wild.
So how many issues are we talking for Dust to Dust?
We're
Total of 8.
eight.
Yeah. We wrote it as a graphic novel, like I said initially, and when we sat down and broke it down for monthly, it all almost worked out exactly for the page count to be an 8-issue book, and that made a lot of sense.
Now, is it 8 with a promise of potentially more if this is successful, or is it 8 and that's the story?
I don't know how Phil feels about it, but there are a couple of characters that I'm really enamored with, and they become more and more important as the story goes. And I would love to pick up and do another book based just on 2 of those particular characters, moving on after the events in Dust to Dust.
I'd be curious to see if they're my two as well.
I think they probably
I bet
are.
they are. They'd have to be.
So
And I
what
think
can
I might send them to New Orleans.
Yeah.
so what can readers look forward to in the next few issues of Dust to Dust?
Mayhem. Well, you're going to find out what happens to the Olsons, the family that's leaving. You're going to get more backstory on Meadows.
Meadows.
You're going to learn a little bit more about Sarah and what she's up to. She's sort of one of the what was the program where they sent everybody around to photograph the
Oh, WPA.
WPA?
PA.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that
Where
makes total sense. She's, that's a real person.
Yeah.
Those people were exactly like, they were working like that.
John Vachon and all those guys.
Lang. Yeah.
So there were a lot of people photographers that were basically on the government dime just to document what was going on in the country, and it gave them a little bit of a living at the same time.
And Eleanor Roosevelt, she had a lot to do with that, right? Is that correct? Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And like I said, Dust to Dust, I mean, it's an incredible looking book. It's a very entertaining, interesting book. It's fascinating because you do feel like as you're reading it, you kind of feel like you're in the period. Like you kind of do feel like you're transported back to 1935 Oklahoma. I think it's a very great book, guys. I greatly appreciate you coming on the show. And like I said, when is Dust to Dust issue 2 ready?
20
End of the month.
20,
end of
yeah.
January. I think the 29th or something right there at the end of.
Yeah, 29th.
All right. Well, like I said, guys, thank you so much. Please come back anytime to talk about more books, or maybe we can talk about the wrap up Dust to Dust. Talk about it at the end of the series when it's over. But you guys, it was a great pleasure talking to you both.
Thank you very much.
I enjoyed
it. Jeff, it was great seeing you. It's been 16, 17 years since I've talked to him in person,
Let's fix that fast.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
No problem, guys. Fun. Have a very good night.
You too.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Furnace Stars podcast. Please like and subscribe. Turn for the next episode when Jay Druska boards the mothership to discuss his score to Supernatural. Next voyage, travel on.